This is episode 48 with Joe Sanok.
Welcome to the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast, the show that empowers you to become the hero of your life's journey. With your host, Brian Tier.
Hey guys and girls, welcome back to another episode of the Quarter Life Comeback Podcast, episode 48 today, and I'm really excited to be speaking to Joe Sanok. Now, Joe is a speaker, mental health counselor, business consultant, and a podcaster who's been featured on the Huffington Post, Reader's Digest, Bustle, and Yahoo News. Joe spent a lot of his 20s traveling and figuring out what it was he wanted to do with his life. And now, as a practicing counselor, he works with a lot of 20-something clients who are also trying to get clear on their life path. Joe went through a series of challenging family events in 2012, which ultimately forced him to slow down and take a closer look at how he was doing things. In this episode, you're going to learn ways we're damaging our brains in our 20s and what to do about it, how to find your life path, how to tell if it's time to leave your job for your side gig, advice for dealing with major grief, trauma, or crisis, tips for leveling up in your 20s, and Joe's 7 steps for setting, achieving, and outsourcing goals. As always, you can get the links and resources we mentioned in this episode at briantier.com/048. But for now, let's go hang out with Joe. Welcome back, everyone, and a big welcome to today's guest. I'm speaking to Joe Sanok. Joe, welcome to the Quarter Life Comeback.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is awesome to be here.
Yeah, we connected via, I think it was Samantha, at the time of this recording last year, 2016. So I'm excited to have you on the show now and to get into the stuff we're going to get into. But for people who are listening who don't know who Joe Sanok is and what you're all about, why don't you give us a little sneak peek and explain a bit about your quarter life story?
Sure. So there's kind of 2 parts to my life, and one part is I own a counseling private practice in Traverse City, Michigan, in the United States, and I have 8 counselors here that work for me and do different types of mental health counseling. As well, I have a private practice consulting business where I help people to plan, start, and grow businesses. And primarily it's counselors in private practice. I have a podcast as well. It's the #1 podcast for counselors in private practice. And I teach them basic business principles to level up their career.
Yeah, I love it. And we'll get into that a bit later in the show, how you made that transition. But I'm excited to have you on. I think I've been having a lot of sort of 20-something guests themselves and people who are doing really cool things. And while I do love that type of guest, I also do want to get some guests on who've been through their 20s and can almost act as a mentor to people listening. So I'm excited to be speaking to you today. And you mentioned that, you have a therapy practice or a counseling practice. And we spoke just before the recording that you do work with a lot of people in their 20s. So what are some of the common things you see people coming to you for in their 20s?
Yeah, so a lot of the big issues that people come to counseling for in their 20s tend to be around life direction, figuring out what to do with their lives, and really moving away from their parents in a number of different ways. So that can look like moving away financially from their parents, physically moving away from their parents, and then also emotionally moving away from their parents. So for myself, in my 20s, both my parents worked for the school system. So my dad was a school psychologist, my mom was a school nurse. And so identifying what I wanted to do with my life was really important. And so some of the things that I did that I'm really glad that I did is I had a variety of different types of jobs in my 20s where I could see what was out there, what I liked, and not get pigeonholed into just doing one type of counseling job. So I had a master's degree in counseling. I went to a few different nonprofits that I worked for. I traveled a bunch, really took advantage of my 20s to see the world, understand the world, and then get a better direction of where I wanted to spend my precious resources of time and money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned like dealing with, separation from the parents. It's like when we are young, all we can complain about is like, oh, I'm sick of living with my mom and dad, or they're always up in my grill, and then that ends up becoming like something that we struggle with.
Yeah, and I think that for a lot of people in their 20s, so much of what your parents did for you, you don't even realize. And so some parents have really hovered over their kids. And I'm seeing more of this in a lot of the people I see, where the parents haven't even like taught them to do laundry. And they're starting to really realize like, oh my gosh, like I need to learn all these skills. And it's unfortunate that parents haven't fostered more of that independence. But I know that in my community, a lot of parents kind of were so scared of their kids getting injured, they would hover over them and they'd do everything for them. And it becomes a really tough transition for people in their early 20s. I think by your mid and late 20s, you start to really get in a groove. But helping people figure out like what are areas that I can genuinely separate away from my parents and do this on my own is really, I think, an important area to figure out so you have that autonomy and you can feel that success in your 20s.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of what people call the quarter life crisis. It's like suddenly now you're forced to go out there and learn all these things on your own. And it's like, I think the combination of all those different things just comes to a head and freaks us out.
Right.
So you mentioned that, sorry, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, well, I think I work with a lot of parents that have people that are in their 20s that are either living at home or they're concerned about them in one way or another. And one thing that I often remind parents and people that are in their 20s is that our brains don't fully develop until we're around age 25 or 26. And so the frontal lobe, the last part of your brain to develop, is the part of your brain that really helps with decision making, understanding the consequences of our actions, and really connecting the dots between if I do this activity and it leads to something positive, I need to remember that versus something negative happens. And so being cognizant of in your early 20s in particular, you can do things that can damage your brain and not help it to fully develop. And so I think a lot of people in their 20s struggle with that because biologically your brain still is developing until you're 25, 26.
Yeah, I've never heard that before. That's really interesting. So what are some of those things that people are doing in their early 20s that are damaging the development of their brain?
Yeah, so heavy drug use can definitely be something that slows it down. As well, the time in your late teens and your early 20s, the only other time that your brain is creating that kind of activity is when you're an infant and toddler. And so the neuroplasticity of your brain when you're a baby, like you think about how much a baby learns. I have a 2-year-old and she is learning so much every single week. The only other time that we have those kind of fireworks in our brain is in our late teens and early 20s. And so doing things that foster your brain, like eating really well. So having low processed foods, low sugar, like more of a plant-based diet, those sort of things can really help your brain do well. As well, having a less amount of screen time, especially before bed, that's really important. When you're in school, most of the research says that if you want to best use your brain, you need to be sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night, which is crazy. That's so much sleep. But your brain is sorting through so many different things, especially in your early 20s, where it's saying, okay, I learned all this stuff during the day. Now, what of this should I keep and what of this should I get rid of? And if your brain doesn't have the time to really sort through all of that, you're not optimizing the learning that you can have that's going to help you the rest of your life.
Man, 20-somethings must love you when you tell them to cut down on Snapchat.
Well, and it's funny because, say, someone's home from school for the summer and living at home and the parents are like, oh, he sleeps until noon. I'm like, let him. His brain is like bouncing back. You need to let him sleep, let her sleep, because especially in your late teens and in your early 20s, you really want to make sure that you're fostering that brain, and sleep it's one of the best ways you can do that.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a freak when it comes to sleep. I've got the whole eye mask and all that sort of stuff.
That's awesome.
But I think the big distinction is like people think that sleep is what you do when you're not doing anything else. But actually, sleep is so important in order to do everything else. But it's just seen as like this leftover time in the day that you can do whatever you want with.
Right. And really, when you think about it, when do your best ideas come? It's usually when you slow down. It's not when you're stressed and overwhelmed and kind of burning the candle at both ends. It's when you're taking a shower, or when you're on a long drive and you have the radio off. And so when we slow down, these sparks of innovation start to come. And when you're in your 20s, you have so much time ahead of you that you can take these amazing ideas and foster them into something that genuinely changes the world. And so it's important to make sure that you have those health habits habits that foster your brain in a way that's going to help you not just be successful in a financial way, but also in your influence and impact on the world.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the slowing down part, because that's something that I do want to come back to a little later on in this interview. But you mentioned that, a common thing that the 20-something clients that come to you have is figuring out a life direction or a life path. What do you see? Like, are they currently trying to do something to figure that out, maybe incorrectly? And then how would you advise or recommend 20-somethings deal with that issue?
Yeah, so I start with a phrase that I heard. It was right when my wife and I were getting married, when we were probably 25, 26. And it's by this financial planner guy named Dave Ramsey. And he said, are you trying to live the life now that it took your parents a lifetime to build? And for me, that really stuck with me, because so often in our 20s, we've been raised in these beautiful houses maybe, or, even if it's a middle class family, maybe you have 2 cars and you have food on the table and all of these things, but your parents had to work really hard to get to the point where they were at when you left to go off to college, when you went off to school. And that becomes our expectation of, well, I just want to have this nice house, and I want to have, all this great furniture, and I want to be able to go out with my friends. And so for me, hearing that in my 20s was probably one of the best things that could have happened, because it made me realize where my parents were at when I left to go off to college. They were, 20 years into their careers and were making a lot more money than I would make fresh out of school. And so having that realistic financial expectations is really a great motivator for deciding, where am I going to spend my time and energy? Is that going to be in school? Is that going to be in life direction? Is that going to be in creating a blog or a podcast that's going to help level up my career? Those are all decisions that, when you have that mindset of, I have to kind of hustle for a while to really make it in this world, that can really help you make better decisions in your 20s that help your financial bottom line and your happiness over your lifetime.
Yeah, got it. And I think social media again is kind of guilty there, as we see like all these highlight reels and good sort of happy golden ticket moments, but actually like that kind of resets what we think we should be doing. And that, that'll just add further to the stress of not having everything figured out. Yeah,
there was actually a really interesting study, Brian, where they looked at people's depression that already dealt with depression after social media compared to when they went on sort of social media fasts. And for the exact reason that you just explained, people tended to feel more depressed the more they spent time on social media, because they were seeing those highlight reels. Everybody around them is on vacation, and everybody around them is eating delicious meals places. But this is, somebody's 1 or 2 times a week that they're posting pictures, or 1 or 2 times a day of the highlights of the day. It's not their everyday reality. And so you end up feeling like, well, what's my life worth if I see all this great stuff around me? But in reality, that's not actually what's happening.
You mentioned like one of the things, like starting a blog or starting a podcast. And this is actually something that you've done yourself. And you started out obviously in quite a traditional career path. But you're not doing that right now. So where did that change take place, and how did that all happen?
Yeah, so it was probably 2010. I got a job at a community college working as a counselor. And when you think about the top positions for counselors in my area, that was one of the highest paid positions in my area. And so really I had, in my early 30s, hit kind of the top for the counseling world. And I started to think, okay, the only way that I can make more money is with this I had a side counseling private practice, so I can work harder there. I could do more hours. So instead of just doing 40 hours at my full-time job, I could put in like 5 or 6 hours on the side, charging $150 per session. And that didn't make sense to me over the long term, that in order to make more money, I just had to work harder. I knew that my wife and I were going to be having kids in the coming years, and we had all these different things. So I started this website called Practice of the Practice, where I just started blogging about what I was learning in private practice around marketing and business. Because for us in grad school, we don't learn those things in counseling grad school. And I just would read a book and say, here's what I got from it. Here's how I'm applying it. I was genuinely a co-learner. And shortly after that, I launched a podcast to start interviewing people and talking about the things that I was learning. But then 2012 hit, and my mom was diagnosed with cancer. and she was going through all this radiation and chemotherapy. And our daughter, who was 3 months old at the time, was diagnosed with a heart condition. And we went into the hospital. They had a really long surgery, and they came back and said, we can't fix it. We actually found that things are worse than we thought. And you're going to have to go to a different hospital 2 months from now. So the day that we thought that we were done with this journey became the first chapter in a much longer journey. So then a couple months go by, and my daughter has open heart surgery, and she's fine. Things are going well. It was as good as it could have been. And then 2 weeks after we get the all clear, like she's fixed, we're all good, I get diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And it's like, oh my gosh, I am so sick of going to hospitals. Yeah. So we go down to Texas for me to meet with the surgeon. And while we're down there, my mom has a heart attack. She then has to have surgery. I then have thyroid surgery. My wife then has a miscarriage, and one of our best friends gets breast cancer. So 2012 was one of those storms of stuff that it's like you don't wish on anybody. And we all have variations of a 2012 in our life at some point. But what I took away from that was that every time that I worked on my side gig, every time that I worked on my podcast, I had to ask myself, like, why am I spending time on this podcast when my daughter's about to have open heart surgery? Why am I spending time on this blog post when I'm going to get like cancer treatment in a couple of weeks? Like, why am I not spending time with my family? And it helped me get into some really good habits of setting clear boundaries around how I was productive in my work on the side, and how I slowed down on the weekends. Like, I intentionally took a Sabbath where we didn't do any social media. I didn't work on my business, even though I was working full time still and doing all the side stuff. On the weekends, I'm fully present for my kids and my wife and friends. And so I got in those habits. And then what happened was it started to scale more and more, because instead of just, I'm going to jump on Facebook and try to promote my business, it was, okay, how can I get on Facebook for 5 minutes a day and get the biggest return on investment of my time? Because I had to do that through all of 2012 out of necessity. And so it was really important for me to look at how I used my time and get into those good habits. So then about 2 years ago, I went to my boss at my full-time job and I said, so here's the thing. My side business is making way more than it is here at my full-time job. Out of courtesy to you, I wanted to give you a proposal. I'll stay here half-time if I can have my full-time wages and all of my health insurance. And she just laughed. We had a good relationship. And she's like, I can't take that to the board. And I was like, I at least had to try. So then I put in my resignation and left full-time, and have had, so much more impact, influence, and income since I left.
Yeah, I love that. And especially that you started building it just to share what you were learning. It wasn't like, how can I make money on the side? And then it just became that as more and more people found value in what you were doing. And also that, you started building it up while you had a full-time job. We often see today, people are like, well, I'm just going to go and quit and pursue my passion. But I think that's a really dangerous place to be in. And so then how, like, if someone's listening to this and they maybe have started a side gig, how do you know when it is time to transition full-time into your own stuff? Is it a financial mark, or how do we know that?
Yeah, so I'm really risk averse. And so I ran numbers over and over and over. And actually on Practice of the Practice, there's a tool that I created that's based on the tool that I used in my own family of how to leave your full-time job. And so for me, it started with, if things got really bad, what would it take for our family to survive? For the Sanok family personally, like, how much do we actually need? So if we just paid the mortgage, just had food that we made at home, paid for the bare necessities, how much would that take? And so then I took that number and figured out how many counseling clients, consulting clients, how much money I had to bring in per month. And when you do that, you often realize, okay, if things got really bad, it's not going to take as much money as I have coming in right now. So if your mortgage is $1,000, if all your other expenses are $1,000, and you look at, okay, I need to bring in $3,000 a month to continue. it's really a lot easier to leave when you start to say, okay, if it got really bad, how much do I need? And then run the numbers of, for me to continue the lifestyle that I have right now, what would I need to bring in? And that makes it a lot easier when you work backward from those numbers. So when I work with my consulting clients, I'll often have them just pull out the calculator on their phone, and I'll say you want to make like $80,000 a year. And we divide that by like 48 weeks in a year. So you have a month off every year. That's $1,666 per week that you have to bring in. And if you want to work, say, 20 hours a week, that means you need to charge at least $83.33 per hour for the work that you do that's billable. And so if you're a freelancer or a counselor or a consultant, you then have an idea of what you need to charge based on the lifestyle you want to live.
Yeah, I love that. So going a little bit more into the sort of calculator side and not just jumping and hoping a net will appear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll definitely link to that calculator in the show notes. I think that sounds really valuable for people listening.
Yeah, I mean, you just take your pay stub and you plug in everything that you have to pay, and then it gives you kind of an apples to apples amount that you need to charge per client and how much you need to bring in.
Cool. I'll definitely check that out. Just before we move on, you mentioned the kind of the 2012 year, and my family experienced that to quite a degree last year. And coming from the counseling side, like how do you like if people are listening and they've dealt with that too, like how do you go about dealing with that type of thing?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of different things to keep in mind. I had a friend who, right before we were going into the hospital, he was a former hospital social worker. So every day for years, he had helped families that were going through crisis. And he would tell them, if you just stopped smoking, go back to smoking. Right now is not the time to make these big lifestyle habits and add extra stress to your life. And for me, that was actually... I was like, what? Like, you're telling people to go smoke in a hospital? That's ridiculous. But then as I thought about it, I realized that really when you're in the midst of crisis, you just want to get through it with all the people that started the crisis. Like, you don't want anyone to die if possible. If people have passed away, like, you want to handle that grief in a way that doesn't ruin relationships. And really, like, it's a time to tread water and not to like swim towards the shore. So when you think that way, you get through it, but then what often comes out are kind of some bad habits. And so I know that through that 2012, I drank more wine at night than I probably should have. My wife and I didn't work on a relationship as well. So 2013, that summer, it really came to a head where my wife said to me, I think I need to go move in with my parents for a little bit. And that was a big wake up call for me because we had just got through 2012. Like, now we're going to potentially break up and like ruin our marriage. And so what happens is you kind of survive, but oftentimes you get into these bad habits. And so then we worked on our relationship. We got into counseling. I read some different books on marriage and ways to think about things and took ownership for the things that I could. So when you're in the midst of grief, trauma, crisis, I think the first thing is make sure you tread water. Just what are the bare necessities? Make sure you're eating well as much as you can. Don't make any major lifestyle changes, and do your best not to take out the grief on your family members and friends. And then once you're done with it and things kind of simmer down, really step back and say to yourself, so what do I need to do to repair and rebuild all that happened last year? I mean, I don't know what you went through last year, but it's terrible when stuff goes down. And so sometimes the next year, it needs to be sort of a rebuilding year.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Thanks for sharing that. Cool. So I want to circle back to the 20-somethings out there listening to this. And I know when we were chatting via email, you said that this is something you feel like you could add to the value of the conversation. So what are some tips for leveling up in your 20s so that you can, enjoy more success in later decades?
Yeah. So time is the biggest asset for people in their 20s. I wish that I had launched the podcast idea that I had when I was in my 20s. I didn't take the time to do it, and I just kind of bumped along. So I think really those big ideas that you have the time, and it may not feel like it. Like, I look back at my 20s and I say, what did I spend my time doing? I felt really busy. But now that I have kids and, a wife and all these things, there's a lot of obligations I have
that I just have to do. I have to, when I get home, I have to play with my kids, or I get to play with my kids. I help with dinner. I help get them into bedtime. And it's like, it goes from 4:30 to 8:30 in like no time with just keeping up with the household. So looking at what are some ideas that you could take some action on. They're not going to be perfect. And so frequently, I think people in their 20s get paralyzed by perfection instead of just getting things done. So going after those ideas and starting something, to me, would be more important than starting it perfectly. And then once you've started something, really start to kind of go through a 7-step process of focusing in on the one thing that's really going to help amplify that. So I don't know if this would be a good time to take them through kind of the 7 steps I do to set, achieve, and outsource goals. But I think it would be really applicable to 20-somethings.
Yeah, totally. Let's get into that.
Sure. So I earlier referenced that, we slow down to spark innovation. So that's sort of like if you think of 3 big steps. So first you have to kind of slow down and take all the things you're consuming. So podcasts like this. Now I have all these ideas, some sparks coming. I've slowed down. Now what do I do with that? So under the innovate step, there's 7 different ways that you do this. And it's sort of like a mountain. So you picture yourself going up the mountain on one side that's moving into the goal. And then at the top of that, you have the next 3 steps. And then the last step is going to be kind of coming down from the goal. So first we want to evaluate where you're at. So evaluate what's working, evaluate what information you need. So maybe you have an idea, but you don't know enough about that industry, about becoming an expert in that industry, about blogging. What are just like the technical skills that you need, and evaluate that to consume some information. So after you evaluate, you're going to define if you're starting something new or if you're amplifying something established. And so you may have an idea that you already kind of got going and something's working in it. Maybe you're monetizing an ebook, for example, and you're making $100 a month off of it. Well, what worked in that, and what can we amplify within that? Maybe you retweak the ebook, maybe you change it a little bit, or maybe you launch another ebook. So defining whether you're starting something new or whether you're amplifying something that's already working. So evaluate, define, and then plan. So in planning, we want to look at what is that 1-year goal for this specific thing that you're working on. And then if we break that down by the month, if we break it down by the week, and then the day, we can then really look at what's that thing that's going to move the needle forward. So if you go out to coffee with a friend and he or she is running 20 minutes late, what can you do to keep moving that goal forward during that 20 minutes rather than just sitting and getting on Snapchat? So really making sure that you're using that time, because we have all these micro moments every day that we just waste away. And so instead, you're looking at how do I plan out my time so I can have micro goals that I can do in those 5 to 15 minutes when I'm standing in line at the grocery store even, that's going to move that goal forward. So evaluate, define, plan. Then we get to kind of the top of that goal. And when you have these innovative ideas, the next step is to create content. So that could be a podcast like what you're doing, Brian. It could be infographics. It could be repurposing things. So maybe Brian's going to take all of his podcasts, have them transcribed, have a virtual assistant make them into a beautiful ebook that's a download. So creating content that really attracts your ideal client.
You're giving away my secrets here, Joe.
Oh, no. Well, I totally believe in giving it all away, because if you give away the best stuff, then the stuff that people have to pay for, they're going to be like, I have to have that because the free stuff is so valuable. Mm-hmm. Next, you're going to want to attract partners that are going to be thrilled to have you as a partner. So, for example, I have these consulting clients, Cupola Media, and they do videos for therapists. And they have the most amazing ebook about how to use video in your private practice to attract an ideal client. This ebook is so good that I'm going to give it away to every single one of my consulting clients, because they walk them through how to focus on your ideal client, how to use your iPhone or equipment really well to attract your ideal client. And it's just a beautifully done ebook. So I'm a natural partner for them, and I'm attracted to it because I don't have to then create this ebook. They've already created it. So it makes me look good that I'm partnering with people that are creating that good content. So after we've created, attracted, then we really want to overserve people. And so this looks different depending on your industry. For some people, that might be that you respond to emails really quickly, or you hire a virtual assistant to respond to emails really quickly. It might be that you respond to people on social media really quickly. It might be that you give extra bonuses to them as you've created different things. And so once we've overserved, then you want to look at kind of coming down from that mountain and outsourcing as much of this goal as you can. So when we have innovative ideas, what happens is inside of our brain, we want to achieve them. Evolutionarily, our brain is created to achieve goals. And then when we achieve it, we get this huge release of endorphins. It's like the feel-good juices of our brain. Our bodies are like, yeah, we did it. But then what happens is we move on to the next goal and keep adding things to our plate without ever taking it off of our plate. And so then we get all this stress and anxiety and worry that covers up all those new ideas. And so we need to be outsourcing as much as we can of each goal to other people to work on.
Yeah, I love that. Outsourcing is something that I'm going to be exploring probably during the course of this year, so that I have more time.
Drop me an email. I have like 4 virtual assistants right now doing a variety of different things, and it's way more affordable than most people think it is.
Yeah, even like the editing of the show, it takes me like a few hours for each episode, and I could be brainstorming new projects and doing more like coaching in that time. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's a great example. And so looking at where are you spending your time where you don't need to. So about a year ago, I realized that how much time I was spending on my podcast in editing it, in making, show notes, in creating beautiful design. And I have more of an artistic bend. And so it looked really good and people would comment on that. But when I brought Sam on as my virtual assistant, now I record the podcast. I hardly edit it at all. It might take me 15 minutes of editing. She then listens through, makes the show notes. She creates, infographics for it and just makes it happen. And so I now spend 15 minutes versus 3 hours. So I can actually go bill out, $600 or $700 an hour for consulting rather than, spend it just, doing something I could pay somebody for.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah.
Don't steal Sam. Don't steal Sam.
All right, Joe, I do want to be mindful of the time here, but before we wrap up, I've got some quick fire questions at the end. So just the first thing that comes to mind and in a sentence or two is perfect.
Sure.
The first one is, what do you wish you'd been told in your 20s?
I wish I had been told that I didn't have to be perfect in the things that I tried to do.
I love that. What is the greatest opportunity for quarter lifers today?
I would say travel. Never before have we been able to travel like we can. And the things that you can learn from that experience, I think will shape you into a more unique person.
I love that. Joe, I've got one more question before I get to that. I just want to take a second to acknowledge you for coming on the show today and for, making it through that tough year and coming out the other side stronger. But also the work that you do in helping people deal with their own issues. It's really such valuable work, and now helping other people do the same thing. Before I get to the final question, where can people go to find out more about you and all the work that you've got going on?
Yeah, the best place is practiceofthepractice.com, and it's for people that are planning, starting, or growing a business. Even if it's not a private practice, there's tons of good, useful content there. And then also, I have a conference next summer called Slow Down School, where we're going to be slowing down and hanging out on Lake Michigan here in northern Michigan. And then we're going to spark innovation and walk through how to grow their businesses.
Nice. That sounds really good. Joe, the final question that I do have is, what one thing can listeners do this week to start creating their own quarter life comeback?
I would say launch something. So if you don't have a website, launch a website. If you already have a website, launch a podcast or do more blogs. Launch something this week that's going to get you out there to be able to build an audience so that you can eventually build an income.
I love that. Joe, thank you so much for coming on the Quarter Life Comeback.
Brian, it's been awesome. Thank you.
So there you have it, guys and girls. That wraps up this week's episode of the Quarter Life Comeback podcast. And a huge thanks once again to Joe Sanok for coming on and sharing not only his story of personal struggles and challenges, but also his tips on setting goals, leveling up in your 20s, and all the rest of the good stuff that he shared with us today. If you like this one, please share it around with your friends on social media and shoot me a tweet at Brian Tier to let me know your biggest takeaway. For me, it was the little nugget of wisdom that Joe shared right at the end of, what you can do this week is just start something, just build something. If you have a website, create a new, social outlet for that, or some new content. If you don't have a website, get started with that. But it doesn't even have to be something online. If there's a little project or side gig you're thinking about starting, just explore how you can get started this week. Now, as always, you can get the links and resources we mentioned in the show at briantier.com/048. And until next week, keep creating your quarter life comeback.
Thanks for listening to the Quarter Life Comeback. Get started today by visiting briantier.com.